Metropolis Part 1, The Miracle and the Sleeper. Probably the most famous Dream Theater song. It introduced the world to their unique brand of progressive metal. It spawned one of the best concept albums in Metropolis Part 2. It's the encore song for many Dream Theater shows. It's the one reaction channels choose as their first Dream Theater song. And it's one of my least favorite songs on Images and Words. Now, I think Metropolis is a great song. In fact, all of the songs on Images and Words are really good. And it being one of my least favorites is kind of like it being my 5th or 6th favorite flavor of ice cream. At the end of the day, it's still really good. But there's a question I've been trying to answer. Is Metropolis Part 1 the quintessential Dream Theater song? And before I can answer that properly, you need to know a little bit about my history with Dream Theater. I was a 17-year-old kid in 2005, just getting really serious about the guitar. I discovered Van Halen and Zeppelin and Stevie Ray Vaughan and Megadeth and Metallica, and I was learning a ton. When I was a kid, I would get new issues of Guitar Player magazine each month, and I would take the lessons, cut them out, and put them into this binder, which I still own. And one of the lessons I came across was by this guy named John Petrucci. I thought the lesson was great, and I saw that he was in a band called Dream Theater, so I looked up their latest album on iTunes, which at the time was Train of Thought, and I listened to the preview of the first track, As I Am, and I was hooked. So I instantly bought the whole album, and as soon as the solo in As I Am kicked in, my whole world changed. For the next 2 years, Dream Theater was basically my whole life. I bought every album, tab books, merchandise. I learned as many songs as I could on guitar, usually pretty poorly. I even flew down from Alaska to San Francisco on spring break of my senior year in high school to watch Dream Theater on the 20th anniversary tour. Dream Theater introduced me to the entire world of prog. It's the whole reason this channel exists and that I've chosen the musical path that I have. Dream Theater even solidified my decision to pursue music and go to music school. So in 2006, I did just that. I spent 4 years studying music at the Lionel Hampton School of Music in Moscow, Idaho, graduating in 2010 with my bachelor's degree in classical guitar performance. During that time, I really branched out musically. In addition to all of the classical music I was learning and studying, I played in jazz band and jazz combos, I deepened my knowledge of blues and rock, I delved into funk, country, and world music, and slowly my obsession with Dream Theater turned into just a normal appreciation of the band. After graduating, I moved to the Seattle area to pursue my career in music, but even after all of my studying, prog continued to be my main love. I joined an awesome progressive metal band in Seattle, A Sense of Gravity. We put out an album in 2016. I put out my first solo album. I finally quit my day job and became a full-time musician, and I started up the Prog School. And that brings us back to 2022. Now, 17 years later, I feel like I can look at Dream Theater much more objectively. If you had asked me in 2006 if I thought there was a bad Dream Theater song, I probably would have said no, that they were perfect musicians who could do no wrong. But obviously every musician and band has released music of varying quality levels. God knows I've written my fair share of bad music. In my time as a fan, I've come across a lot of people that just don't like Dream Theater. And music is of course subjective, but I think a lot of the critiques that people level at Dream Theater have some merit. That brings me back to the main question: is Metropolis the quintessential Dream Theater song? Now, my first instinct is to say no, because I think Metropolis plays into the 4 major critiques that I see leveled at Dream Theater the most often. So to answer this question properly, I want to put Metropolis up against these critiques, starting with... This is a major criticism of Dream Theater, that they focus too much on being complex and technical, that there's way too much noodling and way too much wankery. This is an interesting one for me to grapple with, because the technicality is the main reason I fell in love with Dream Theater in the first place. The over-the-top solos and insanely complex songs really spoke to the 17-year-old me that was trying to become the best guitarist that he possibly could, and I owe a lot of my technical abilities on the guitar to Dream Theater. Complexity is a core element of what makes Dream Theater Dream Theater. Without it, they wouldn't have had the impact and legacy that they do. With all that said, I do think this is a fair criticism, and Dream Theater do go overboard on the crazy instrumental passages, sometimes at the expense of the song as a whole. Something like The Ministry of Lost Souls is a good example. The long instrumental section feels pretty out of place and distracts from the song. I've also never been a huge fan of the Dance of Eternity for this same reason. It's impressive from a technical perspective, but ultimately doesn't offer much beyond the sheer complexity of it. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but I like it when the complexity is there to make a song better. When it's done in the right place, though, I think the technicality of Dream Theater is actually one of their strongest attributes. The complexity brings a nice balance to the big melodies and straightforward riffs that they're also good at writing. Songs like Blind Faith, Fatal Tragedy, Octavarium, Learning to Live, Scarred, these are all made better by the over-the-top instrumental passages that help to balance out the other sections of the songs. It is a tough thing to balance properly, though, and sometimes Dream Theater can tip the scale too heavily towards the complexity. But what about Metropolis? It has what I would consider to be the prototypical Dream Theater instrumental section. It's super long, about half the length of the song, it goes a million different directions, and it features some absolutely insane playing. Now, I think this is an example of Dream Theater leaning too far towards complexity for complexity's sake. Not that the instrumental section shouldn't be there, but it could have used with a little bit of trimming. At this point in their career, Dream Theater was a new band with something to prove, and it takes some serious balls to put out music like this in 1992, right when grunge was taking off. They were doing what they wanted, and they didn't care what people thought, and it's one of the reasons that I love Dream Theater and this album so much. As musicians grow and mature, they start to hone in their craft, and by the time you hit the Scenes from a Memory era of Dream Theater, they found that perfect balance between complexity and simplicity, but then again, that's the era of Dream Theater that I first fell in love with, so I'm probably pretty biased towards it. So is the Metropolis instrumental section the quintessential example of Dream Theater's technicality and complexity? I'd say yes. I don't think it's the best Dream Theater instrumental section, but it's the one that laid the groundwork for what's to come, and in that way, it's quintessential Dream Theater. This is another common criticism of Dream Theater, that they're way too obvious when it comes to their influences, specifically bands like Metallica, Rush, Yes, and Pink Floyd. This is a fair critique. Pull Me Under, As I Am, Peruvian Skies, and especially Constant Motion have a very heavy Metallica influence. The Looking Glass and Transcending Time are basically heavy Rush songs. And The Spirit Carries On has a ton of Pink Floyd in it. It can be a little bit on the nose for me sometimes, and it's one of the reasons I'm not a huge Pull Me Under fan, but for the most part, Dream Theater do a good job of paying tribute to their influences without ripping them off. All musicians are a product of their influences to a certain extent. When I was 18, all of my music sounded like Dream Theater because that's what I was listening to. It takes some time to develop your own voice as a songwriter. And just like the issue of Dream Theater focusing too much on complexity, later in their career they were able to find that balance between acknowledging the music that made them who they are and creating their own sound. Metropolis Part 1 actually does a really great job of this. Dream Theater is often described as Metallica meets Yes, and this song is the perfect marriage of those two sounds without ripping off either of them. There is this chord that plays in the instrumental section. And this is the exact chord that gets used at the beginning of Rush's Cygnus X1 Book 2 off of Hemispheres. Now, John Petrucci is heavily influenced by Alex Lifeson, as a lot of us prog guitarists are, so I don't think that this is really that big of a deal. In fact, I've probably used this chord voicing myself a number of times. But is Metropolis the quintessential example of Dream Theater's musical style? I think so. The influence of Rush, Metallica, and Yes are there, but blended into something unique, something that would come to define the sound of Dream Theater and of progressive metal as a whole going forward. Alright, it's time to talk about the vocals. This is probably what turns people off the most when it comes to Dream Theater. Here's my honest opinion. James is an incredibly talented singer, but the sound of his voice is very much an acquired taste, and time has not been kind to it. There are plenty of singers out there whose voices either had to grow on me or I just don't care for. Geddy Lee took some time for me to appreciate, and James LaBrie was the same way. I was drawn in by the music of Dream Theater, and over time I grew to love the vocals, specifically on these early albums. James' vocals on Images and Words and Awake are incredibly good, and though his tone might not be for everyone, even his biggest critics could admit that the skill needed to perform these parts is very high. Fans of Dream Theater will know that James had a terrible bout of food poisoning in 1994 and it ruptured his vocal cords. The fact that he's still singing to this day is pretty miraculous, but the accident had a real effect on his voice. He's never been able to fully reclaim the higher end of his voice in quite the same way, but he's continued to sound very good for a long time after this accident, and Dream Theater has done a good job of changing their writing approach to work with James's voice as he's aged. The voice is one of the hardest instruments to maintain at a high level, especially if you're performing technically challenging music. And that's just the nature of getting older, and you add the vocal accident into that, and it's a tough place to be in for James. Whatever you think about his singing in 2022, his voice is an integral part of the sound of Dream Theater, and a much bigger reason for their success than some people would give him credit for. It's also important to remember when James joined Dream Theater. The metal scene was very different in 1992, and the Bruce Dickinson, Jeff Tate, Rob Halford kind of a sound was much more sought after. Prog metal bands these days are usually looking for a very different vocal sound, and it can be hard to appreciate Dream Theater's vocals if you have more modern sensibilities. What about the vocals on Metropolis? Now, I think the vocals on Metropolis are top-tier Dream Theater vocals. This song allows James to showcase his full range, especially the higher part of his voice, which is where he really shines. And while a lot of the song doesn't even have vocals, I think the parts that are there are well written and well performed. Is Metropolis the quintessential example of Dream Theater vocals? I'd say yes. Even if James isn't your cup of tea, I think everyone can agree that the vocals on Metropolis are quite impressive, and he holds his own against the talent of the other four guys in the band. The last major critique of Dream Theater is that they aren't good songwriters, that their songs are just a vehicle for them to stroke their egos, that they don't flow well, they go too many different places, and they feel like exercises rather than songs. And this is a critique that I very much disagree with. In fact, my favorite element of Dream Theater are the songs. These guys have written some of the best songs in the prog world. Voices, Lines in the Sand, Octavarium, In the Name of God, The Glass Prison, Panic Attack, Breaking All Illusions, Home, The Spirit Carries On, Innocence Faded, Blind Faith, Learning to Live. I could go on and on. When I was 17, the techniques and the solos were what I loved about Dream Theater. But as I've gotten older and become a more mature musician, it's the songs that keep me coming back. I find a lot of Dream Theater's music to be incredibly emotional and moving. But what about Metropolis? This is the one area where I feel like Metropolis is lacking a bit. There's a lot of great ideas in the song, which is obvious because this spawned Metropolis Part 2, which is probably my favorite Dream Theater album, but it doesn't feel like these ideas were fully developed here. Metropolis is by no means an example of terrible songwriting. The song structure makes sense, it builds to dynamic peaks in good places, and the melodic and rhythmic motifs are good on their own. My biggest issue with the song is its lack of repetition. I understand that this is the nature of a lot of Dream Theater's music. The unpredictability keeps the listener engaged, and I'm totally cool with prog going all over the place. In fact, I kind of expect it. The first half of the song doesn't suffer from this quite as much. That main motif from the intro plays a number of times here. With the cool rhythmic permutation. And this secondary riff happens twice. And this all builds in a really nice way to the instrumental. I do miss a really strong melodic hook in the vocals here. These two melodies are pretty similar. There's no more freedom. The city's cold blood teaches us to survive. Just keep your heart in my eye. But they're not really strong enough to be considered a main melodic motif, especially since they don't ever come back again in the song. Once you hit the instrumental section in Metropolis, nothing from earlier in the song comes back at all. Now, it doesn't need to have some kind of super catchy chorus that keeps repeating, but a few hints at previously set up musical ideas in the instrumental section and the ending vocal part would have tied the song together better. In contrast to Metropolis, I think Learning to Live does a really good job of this. These two songs are very similarly structured, but the ending of Learning to Live calls back to the chorus from earlier. It's a variation on that original melody, but it's close enough to act as a nice bookend to the song. There's also material in the instrumental section in Learning to Live that come from other parts of the song. There's these chord stabs in the keyboard, this hint at the earlier choruses, this section from Wait for Sleep, and the chords underneath these little solos are a variation of the chorus chord progression. It still goes a lot of different directions here, but it feels more connected to the song as a whole. There's also the famous F-sharp vocal line in the middle of the instrumental, which breaks it up nicely. Metropolis could have benefited from a similar approach. It's good as it is, and honestly I've listened to it so many times I can't hear it any other way, and I'm not even sure exactly what I'd change, so this obviously isn't a huge negative for me. But is Metropolis the quintessential example of Dream Theater songwriting? I don't think this is the best example of Dream Theater songwriting, but it does have all the elements that make a Dream Theater song a Dream Theater song. Big epic vocals, heavy riffs, long instrumental passages, and it laid the groundwork for what is my favorite album of theirs from a songwriting perspective, Metropolis Part 2. And in that respect, this is quintessential Dream Theater songwriting. But is Metropolis Part 1 the quintessential Dream Theater song? I think if you'd asked me that before I made this video, I would have said no. But 17-year-old me would have said yes. And honestly, this probably says more about me than it does about Dream Theater. Despite some small issues I have with it, Metropolis is still able to reach that 17-year-old part of me. It gets me amped up and makes me want to play guitar for 4 hours straight. And I'm not a kid anymore. I have a family and bills and a million other responsibilities, and it's really hard for me to sit and enjoy music like I did when my only responsibilities were to finish my homework and practice guitar. But when I hear Images and Words, I'm instantly transported to 2005, back when I had my whole life in front of me and everything seemed possible. And it takes some pretty special music to do that. Dream Theater isn't my favorite band anymore, and honestly my love for them is mostly nostalgic at this point, but I owe my entire musical career to Dream Theater, and Dream Theater owes their career to Images and Words, specifically to Metropolis. And on this 30th anniversary of Images and Words, I think I'm finally ready to answer my initial question. Is Metropolis Part 1, The Miracle and the Sleeper, the quintessential Dream Theater song? And my answer is yes. But what's yours?